Elena Vega extended her hand with a shy smile as the executive looked at her with disdain. Her handshake, soft as a feather, provoked barely disguised laughter around the conference table. No one expected this fragile-looking woman to hide a strength capable of bending steel. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. Elena adjusted the strap of her worn bag as she crossed the gleaming lobby of Steel Towers, the most imposing skyscraper in New York City. The building, a monument of glass and metal rising 60 floors above the bustling financial district, seemed specifically designed to intimidate people like her. Her low heels resonated softly against the polished marble, a discreet sound compared to the confident tapping of the Italian shoes surrounding her. The reception area was filled with executives in impeccable suits and leather briefcases that cost more than Elena's monthly rent. Men and women who projected power with every gesture, every measured word, every evaluating glance. Elena, with her carefully ironed second-hand pantsuit and her brown hair pulled back in a simple bun, was aware of every gaze that assessed and dismissed her in a matter of seconds. "May I help you?" asked the receptionist, a woman with a perfect haircut and a silk blouse that probably cost a week's salary for Elena. "Yes, I have an interview with the structural engineering department," Elena replied, keeping her voice firm despite the knot in her stomach. "Elena Vega, at 10 o'clock. The receptionist typed something into her computer and her perfectly lined eyebrows arched slightly. "You're the candidate for the chief materials engineer position?" The question carried implicit surprise, barely disguised disbelief. Elena was already accustomed to this reaction. "That's correct," she confirmed with a polite smile that concealed years of having to prove her worth in a world that constantly questioned her place in it. 58th floor, said the receptionist, handing her an access card. "Someone will meet you there." As Elena waited for the elevator, she noticed the curious glances of two executives conversing nearby. One of them, a middle-aged man with a watch that shone ostentatiously on his wrist, leaned toward his companion. "Did you see that?" "Must be the new HR assistant," he commented, at a volume sufficient for Elena to hear. "Too plain to be an executive," the other replied with a barely contained laugh. "Probably here for some administrative position." Elena kept her gaze fixed on the elevator doors, ignoring the comments as she had learned to do throughout her career. The doors opened and she entered, grateful for the momentary respite from evaluating stairs. The elevator was an engineering marvel, all glass and polished steel offering a panoramic view of New York City as it swiftly rose. Normally, Elena would have appreciated the beauty of the design, the elegance of the structural solutions that allowed a glass box to rise to such heights with such smoothness. But today, her mind was occupied reviewing material resistance equations and mentally preparing for the technical questions she knew would come. When the doors opened on the 58th floor, she was greeted by a young assistant with a tablet in hand. "Ms. Vega?" he asked, consulting his device. "This way, please. The committee is already assembled." Elena followed him down a hallway flanked by offices with glass walls. Inside, men and women worked on cutting-edge computers or animatedly discussed in front of whiteboards filled with equations and diagrams. This was her world, the language of numbers and structures she spoke fluently, though few people believed it when they saw her. The assistant led her to a conference room where 5 people waited around a glass table, 4 men and 1 woman, all with serious expressions and open folders in front of them. "May I present Elena Vega," the assistant announced before discreetly withdrawing. The man at the head of the table, Javier Montero, director of engineering according to the badge on his lapel, stood up to greet her. He was tall, with premature gray hair that gave him an air of authority and gray eyes that quickly evaluated her. "Ms. Vega, welcome," he said, extending his hand. Elena extended hers for the formal handshake. Her hand, small compared to Montero's, momentarily disappeared in the greeting. She squeezed with the softness that had always characterized her professional interactions. She immediately noticed how Montero's expression changed, a flash of disappointment crossing his face. Beside him, another executive coughed slightly, hiding a mocking smile. "Please, have a seat," Montero indicated, pointing to the only empty chair. "We've reviewed your resume with interest. I must admit it's unusual for someone of your profile to have achieved such credentials." Elena sat with a straight back, placing her worn leather folder on the table. Thank you for the opportunity. I'm eager to discuss how my experience can benefit steel towers. The woman on the committee, Mercedes Fuentes, according to her badge, raised an eyebrow. Doctorate in materials engineering from MIT, postdoctoral research, 3 patents in high-strength alloys. Impressive on paper. But tell us, what really brings you to our company? The question seemed innocent, but Elena detected the subtext. What is someone like you doing aspiring to a position like this? Your sustainable skyscraper projects are revolutionary, Elena replied calmly, but I've noticed that your current structures could benefit from the new alloys I've been developing. Materials that offer greater strength with less weight and carbon footprint. One of the executives, Luis Herrera, according to his identification, let out a short laugh. Sounds ambitious for someone who... He left the phrase hanging, but his gaze running over her modest suit completed the thought. Elena maintained her neutral expression, accustomed to this type of scrutiny. Ambition doesn't depend on appearances, Mr. Herrera. It depends on demonstrable results. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Montero opened a folder in front of him. Let's talk about your practical experience, Ms. Vega. I see you worked on smaller-scale projects in small firms. Steel Towers handles the most innovative skyscrapers in America. Do you really believe you're prepared for that leap? The question was designed to destabilize her, to make her doubt herself. Elena had heard variations of the same question throughout her career. My last project was designing the internal structure of the new wing of Central Hospital, Mr. Montero. It may seem small compared to your skyscrapers, but it required innovative solutions to support heavy medical equipment while maintaining the flexibility needed for future reconfigurations. The scale may be different, but the fundamental principles are the same. Herrera exchanged a glance with another committee member. Theory and practice are very different things, Ms. Vega. This position requires not only technical knowledge, but also leadership. You'll have to lead teams, deal with contractors, handle pressure. It requires a certain presence. The implication was clear. They didn't believe she had the strength necessary to impose herself in a world dominated by men with strong voices and imposing presences. I perfectly understand what leadership entails, Mr. Herrera, Elena replied, maintaining a professional tone. My team on the Central Hospital project consisted of 15 engineers. Authority doesn't always come from the volume of your voice, but from the clarity of your ideas and the consistency of your results. Mercedes Fuentes observed her with growing interest, as if reassessing her first impressions. Let's talk about your patents, especially the one related to the microstructure of steel alloys to increase compression resistance. It's fascinating in theory, but has it been implemented in real structures? For the first time, Elena felt a genuine opening in the conversation. Yes, although on a limited scale. We implemented the alloy in the main columns of Central Hospital, which allowed us to reduce their diameter by 18% without compromising structural integrity. Continuous monitoring data shows that the actual performance exceeds the predictions of our models by approximately 7%. Montero seemed skeptical. Those results haven't been published in any journal that I know of. Because we're still collecting longitudinal data, Elena explained. We prefer a conservative approach before making public claims. But I can share the preliminary reports if you're interested. The interview continued with increasingly specific technical questions. With each answer, Elena demonstrated not only theoretical knowledge, but a deep understanding of practical applications. However, she could feel the persistent resistance from the committee, especially from Herrera and Montero. It wasn't the first time she had faced this kind of skepticism. After almost an hour of technical interrogation, Montero consulted his watch. Well, I think we have a clear idea of your technical capabilities, Ms. Vega. But there's another aspect that concerns us. Elena waited, knowing that the real obstacle was about to be revealed. This position requires constant interaction with clients, many of them foreign, high-level executives who expect to deal with, well, with someone who projects the appropriate image of steel towers. I understand, Elena replied, maintaining her composure. And what do you consider to be the appropriate image, Mr. Montero? The question, formulated with politeness but directness, seemed to momentarily discomfort the director. Our company has standards of excellence in all aspects, Herrera intervened. From our designs to our presentation, clients expect to deal with professionals who reflect those standards. And I reflect my own standards of excellence, Mr. Herrera, Elena responded. In my work, in my professional ethics, and in my results. If those are the values Steel Towers seeks to promote, then we are aligned. Mercedes Fuentes smiled slightly, as if appreciating the response. Montero, however, seemed determined to press further. Let me be frank, Ms. Vega. This position involves confronting difficult contractors, managing large teams, and sometimes imposing authority in complicated situations. It requires firmness. It was then that it happened. As if on cue, an assistant knocked and entered the conference room carrying what looked like a small metal box. He placed it on the table in front of Montero. The demonstration materials you requested, sir, the assistant said before departing. Montero opened the box and removed what appeared to be a cylindrical piece of steel about 6 inches long and 1 inch in diameter. He held it up for everyone to see. This is a sample of the steel we're currently using in our core support columns, he explained. It's the industry standard, capable of withstanding enormous pressure. He placed it on the table and slid it toward Elena. Would you like to examine it? Elena picked up the cylinder, feeling its weight and examining its surface with expert eyes. Grade 60 structural steel, I presume? Good quality, though I noticed some inconsistencies in the finish that might indicate micro-variations in the alloy composition. Herrera laughed openly now. You can tell all that just by looking at it? Impressive party trick, Ms. Vega. Elena placed the cylinder back on the table. Not a trick, Mr. Herrera. Observation based on experience. Montero leaned forward, his expression challenging. You mentioned your revolutionary alloys earlier. Would you care to elaborate on how they differ from what you're holding? Of course, Elena replied, warming to the subject despite the underlying hostility. My alloy incorporates a nanostructured matrix that distributes force more evenly throughout the material. Think of traditional steel as having linear force pathways. When pressure exceeds a certain threshold, those pathways break. My design creates a web of interconnected pathways, so when one begins to fail, the force redistributes automatically. Sounds theoretical, Montero commented dismissively. It's actually quite practical, Elena countered. The principles are derived from biomimicry, studying how natural structures like bone and bamboo achieve remarkable strength with minimal material. Mercedes Fuentes was now leaning forward with genuine interest. And you've tested this experimentally? Extensively, Elena confirmed, both in laboratory settings and in the central hospital implementation. Montero exchanged glances with Herrera, and Elena could read the silent communication. They weren't convinced. More concerning, they seemed determined not to be convinced. Well, theories are one thing, Montero said, picking up the steel cylinder again. Reality is another. In this business, we deal with enormous pressures, both literal and figurative. He held the cylinder between his palms and pressed, his knuckles whitening with the effort. Our materials, like our people, need to be unbreakable under pressure. The message was unmistakable. They didn't believe she had the strength, metaphorical or literal, for the position. Mercedes Fuentes frowned slightly at the display, but remained silent. I understand the metaphor, Mr. Montero, Elena said quietly. Do you? Herrera interjected. This isn't just about knowing formulas and theories, Ms. Vega. It's about having the strength to stand your ground when millions of dollars and people's safety are on the line. It's about presence, authority. He glanced at her small frame, her modest attire, and conviction. Elena had faced this moment many times before, the moment when technical qualifications were set aside in favor of intangible qualities that somehow always seemed to exclude women like her. Usually, she would respond with additional credentials, with reasoned arguments about the value of diverse perspectives in engineering. But something about Montero's theatrical display with the steel cylinder, about the smug certainty in Herrera's voice, made her decide on a different approach. May I? She asked, holding out her hand for the steel cylinder that Montero still held. Somewhat surprised, Montero handed it over, by all means. Elena took the cylinder, feeling its cool weight in her palm. She looked directly at Montero, then at Herrera, and finally at Mercedes Fuentes, who was watching with increasing interest. You're right that engineering isn't just about theories, Elena said, her voice quiet but clear. It's about understanding materials, their properties, their limitations, and their potential. She held the cylinder vertically between her thumb and forefinger, studying it for a moment. "It's about knowing that strength isn't always obvious," she continued, "and that sometimes the most powerful forces come in unexpected packages." With that, Elena placed the cylinder between her palms and closed her eyes briefly, as if concentrating. When she opened them again, there was a new intensity in her gaze. The committee members watched with expressions ranging from amusement to curiosity as Elena began to apply pressure to the steel cylinder. For a moment, nothing seemed to happen. Herrera was about to make another dismissive comment when suddenly a change came over Elena's face. Her soft features hardened with concentration, and her delicate hands, the same hands that had offered such a gentle handshake, began to tremble slightly. The cylinder between her palms began to deform. At first, the change was so subtle that the committee members thought they were imagining it. But then, unmistakably, the perfectly straight cylinder began to bend in the middle, curving like a bow under Elena's steady pressure. Montero's eyes widened in disbelief. Herrera's mocking smile froze and transformed into an expression of shock. Mercedes Fuentes leaned forward, her professional composure momentarily forgotten. The steel, industrial-grade structural steel designed to support massive buildings, was bending in Elena Vega's hands as if it were made of warm clay. With one final surge of effort, Elena completed the bend, forming the cylinder into a U-shape before gently placing it on the table in front of the stunned committee. For a moment, no one spoke. The only sound in the room was Elena's slightly accelerated breathing as she recovered from the exertion. "As I was saying," she finally said, her voice still soft but now carrying an undeniable authority, "sometimes strength comes in unexpected packages. And sometimes, Mr. Montero, the most innovative solutions arise when we challenge our preconceptions about what is possible." The silence stretched for several more seconds before Mercedes Fuentes began to laugh, not mockingly, but with genuine delight. "Well," she said, picking up the bent cylinder and examining it with professional admiration, "I believe Ms. Vega has just given us a rather convincing demonstration of both her technical expertise and her firmness." Montero stared at the bent steel, then at Elena, his expression a complex mixture of disbelief, reassessment, and the beginning of respect. That's impossible," Herrera muttered, reaching for the cylinder to examine it himself. "No one can bend solid steel with their bare hands." "And yet," Elena replied calmly, "the evidence is right in front of you, much like my qualifications, which have been there all along despite your reluctance to acknowledge them." Montero cleared his throat, struggling to regain his composure. "Ms. Vega, would you mind explaining what just happened?" Elena's expression softened slightly. "Of course. What you just witnessed was the practical application of the theoretical knowledge I've been describing. My hands didn't bend at steel. Physics did." "But how?" Mercedes asked, clearly fascinated. "By understanding exactly where and how to apply pressure," Elena explained. "By knowing the molecular structure of this particular alloy and its precise yield points. And by applying a technique I developed during my doctoral research that allows for the concentration of force at specific structural weak points." She paused, looking at each committee member in turn. "In other words, by doing exactly what I would do for steel towers, identifying the precise points where innovation can transform what seems immovable." The atmosphere in the room had transformed completely. Where there had been dismissal and skepticism, there was now attention and, at least from Mercedes Fuentes, growing enthusiasm. "That was impressive," Montero admitted, still staring at the bent cylinder, "but also somewhat concerning. If our structural steel can be manipulated so easily." "Not easily," Elena corrected, "and not by anyone without specific knowledge of its properties. But yes, your concern is valid, which is precisely why my alloy innovations would benefit your projects. The nanostructured matrix I mentioned earlier would make such manipulation virtually impossible, even with the technique I just demonstrated." Herrera, still struggling to process what he had witnessed, shook his head. "I've never seen anything like that. Never even heard of such a thing being possible." "There are many things possible in materials science that aren't widely known outside specialized circles," Elena replied. just as there are many qualified engineers who don't fit the traditional mold. Mercedes Fuentes was now openly smiling. I believe, gentlemen, that we've just been given a rather dramatic lesson in avoiding hasty judgments. Montero straightened his tie, visibly reassessing the situation and the candidate before him. Ms. Vega, I believe we may have underestimated you. Would you be willing to elaborate further on your alloy innovations and how they might be implemented in our current projects? I'd be happy to, Elena replied, opening her worn folder and extracting a neatly organized set of technical diagrams. Shall we begin with the practical applications, or would you prefer to understand the theoretical foundations first? As she launched into a detailed explanation of her work, Elena noticed the shift in how the committee was now regarding her. The dismissive glances had been replaced by attentive focus. The skeptical expressions had given way to genuine interest. Even Herrera was now leaning forward, examining her diagrams with newfound respect. And throughout the presentation, the bent steel cylinder remained in the center of the table, a silent but eloquent testament to the fact that true strength, like true genius, often comes in the most unexpected packages. Elena's demonstration had sent shockwaves through the interview committee. As she finished her technical presentation, the atmosphere in the conference room had transformed completely. Where once there had been dismissive glances and barely concealed smirks, there was now a charged silence filled with reassessment and, from at least some members, grudging respect. That concludes my overview of the potential applications, Elena said, closing her folder. I'd be happy to provide more detailed specifications if you're interested in pursuing any particular aspect further. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. Montero, still visibly processing what he had witnessed, cleared his throat. Ms. Vega, I think we all agree that your demonstration was unexpected. I'd like to propose something equally unexpected. He glanced around at his colleagues before continuing. Rather than completing our standard interview process, I'd like to invite you to join us on a site visit this afternoon. We're facing some unusual challenges with the Horizon project, and I'm curious to see your perspective firsthand. Elena maintained her professional composure, though internally she recognized this for what it was, a test, perhaps an even more demanding one than the interview itself. I'd be happy to join you, Mr. Montero. Mercedes Fuentes smiled approvingly. Excellent. The car leaves at 1 o'clock. That gives you, she checked her watch, about 2 hours. Perhaps you'd like to join me for coffee in the meantime? I have some questions about your postdoctoral work that weren't covered in your presentation. Herrera frowned slightly at this deviation from protocol, but Montero nodded. Good idea, Mercedes. Get Ms. Vega settled in the executive lounge. I'll join you both before we depart. As Elena followed Mercedes from the conference room, she caught a glimpse of Herrera picking up the bent steel cylinder, examining it with lingering disbelief. Some battles were won with dramatic demonstrations, she reflected, but the war for professional respect was far from over. The executive lounge on the 60th floor offered a panoramic view of the city that momentarily took Elena's breath away. Floor-to-ceiling windows revealed a metropolis bathed in midday sunlight, a forest of steel and glass stretching to the horizon. Impressive, isn't it? Mercedes said, noticing Elena's reaction. Sometimes I come up here just to remind myself of the scale of what we do. Each of those buildings represents countless decisions, calculations, compromises, and innovations. It's beautiful, Elena agreed. And humbling. Mercedes guided her to a quiet corner where a sleek coffee machine offered a bewildering array of options. The view sells the romance of engineering, but the reality is often less photogenic. She selected an espresso for herself and gestured for Elena to choose. So tell me, that demonstration with the steel, it wasn't just for show, was it? Elena selected a simple black coffee. No, it was a practical application of principles I've been researching for years. And how many people know you can do that? Elena considered the question carefully. Very few. It's not something I typically demonstrate in professional settings. Mercedes smiled wryly. I can imagine why. But I'm glad you chose to today. Montero and Herrera needed that wake-up call. She led Elena to a seating area by the windows. You should know that the Horizon project is our most ambitious undertaking to date. A 120-story mixed-use tower with structural innovations that are pushing the boundaries of what's currently possible. I've read about it, Elena acknowledged. The cantilever design for the upper 30 floors is particularly interesting. And particularly problematic, Mercedes added. We are experiencing unexpected stress patterns in the simulation models. The current materials aren't performing as anticipated. Elena's professional interest was immediately engaged. Have you considered adaptive stress distribution systems, something that could respond dynamically to changing load conditions? Theoretically, yes. Practically, we haven't found a viable implementation. Mercedes studied Elena over the rim of her espresso cup. Your personnel file mentions you were raised by your grandmother in Queens. No mention of parents. The abrupt change of subject caught Elena off guard. That's correct. My parents died when I was young. My grandmother raised me. And she encouraged your interest in engineering? Elena smiled at the memory. Not explicitly. She was a seamstress. But she taught me about patterns, about how things fit together, about understanding the underlying structure of what appears on the surface. She paused, remembering. She had extraordinary hands, strong from decades of work, but precise enough to place a stitch exactly where it needed to be. She used to say that the right amount of force, applied in exactly the right place, could transform anything. Mercedes nodded thoughtfully. Wisdom often comes from unexpected sources, much like strength. She set down her cup. The men you met today, Montero, Herrera, the others, they're brilliant engineers. But they have blind spots. They've never had to prove themselves the way you have. They've never had to transform themselves to fit into spaces that weren't designed for them. And you? Elena asked quietly. Mercedes smiled. I was the first female structural engineer hired by this firm, 27 years ago. Back then, I couldn't bend steel with my hands, so I had to find other ways to make them see me. She leaned forward slightly. The question now is, what will you do with their attention now that you have it? Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Before Elena could respond, the lounge doors opened, and Montero entered, now wearing a hard hat and carrying another. Time to go, ladies. The car is waiting. The drive to the Horizon Project construction site took 30 minutes, during which Montero briefed Elena on the specifics of the challenges they were facing. The theoretical discussion in the car was a stark contrast to the physical reality that greeted them when they arrived. The construction site was a hive of controlled chaos. The skeleton of what would eventually be one of the city's most iconic buildings rose from the ground like an industrial giant, steel beams reaching skyward amid the constant motion of cranes and the percussion of heavy machinery. Workers in hard hats and safety vests moved with purpose through the organized disorder. Elena felt a familiar thrill as she took in the scene. This was engineering in its raw form. Not just diagrams and calculations, but tangible creation on a massive scale. Here, theory met practice in a dance of physics and human ingenuity. Montero led Elena and Mercedes toward a temporary elevator attached to the building's framework. We're going up to the 40th floor. That's where we're seeing the most concerning stress patterns. The elevator ride was noisy and utilitarian. Nothing like the smooth, silent ascent in steel towers, polished interior. This was a construction elevator, a metal cage that juddered and clanked as it carried them upward, offering increasingly spectacular views of the city through its open sides. When they reached the 40th floor, Elena stepped onto bare concrete, the building still a skeleton at this height. The wind was stronger here, whipping around the exposed beams and incomplete walls. Herrera was already waiting for them, along with a man Elena hadn't met before, introduced as Chief Project Engineer Williams. Ms. Vega, Williams greeted her with a firm handshake and an appraising look. Montero tells me you might have some insights into our situation here. I hope so, Elena replied, though I'll need to understand the specific challenges you're facing. Williams led them to a section where several massive steel beams intersected. This is one of our primary stress points. According to our models, when we add the cantilever sections above, the force distribution will create potentially dangerous strain right here. He tapped a junction where 3 beams met. We've reinforced it beyond specifications, but the simulations still show potential failure points under certain load conditions. Elena studied the structure carefully, her mind already calculating forces, angles, and potential solutions. May I? she asked, indicating her desire to examine the junction more closely. "Be my guest," Williams replied. Elena moved forward, placing her hands directly on the massive steel beam. She closed her eyes briefly, feeling the metal beneath her palms, almost as if she were communing with it. When she opened her eyes again, she began to walk around the junction, examining it from multiple angles, occasionally stopping to place her hands at specific points. The men watched with expressions ranging from skepticism to curiosity. Mercedes, however, observed with growing interest, recognizing that Elena was applying a far more intuitive approach than their standard analytical methods. "The problem isn't just here," Elena finally said, rejoining the group. "It's a cascading effect. The forces from the upper levels will travel down through these junctions in ways your models aren't fully capturing." She pointed to several other nearby junctions. These connections are creating a kind of force echo that amplifies the stress at certain points. Williams frowned. "That's not what our simulations show." "Because your simulations are based on standard materials with predictable properties," Elena explained. "But real-world steel has microscopic variations. No two beams are identical at the molecular level." She turned to Montero. "This is exactly where my alloy innovations could make a difference. A more adaptive material would distribute these forces more evenly, preventing the stress concentration." Quote, Herrera, who had been unusually quiet until now, finally spoke. "That's all theoretical, Ms. Vega. We need practical solutions for a structure that's already under construction." Elena nodded, acknowledging the legitimate concern. "You're right. But there are still approaches we can take with the existing materials." She turned back to the junction. "If we modify these connection points, change the angle by just 3 degrees, and add reinforcement plates with a specific geometry, we can redirect the forces along more favorable pathways." Williams looked skeptical. "That would require custom fabrication that wasn't in the original plans. The cost and time implications would be far less than the cost of structural failure," Elena completed quietly, "or even the cost of the additional standard reinforcement you're currently planning to add." A tense silence followed, broken only by the constant background noise of construction. Then Montero stepped forward. "Show me," he said simply. Elena pulled a small notebook from her bag and quickly sketched her proposed modifications, complete with calculations and force diagrams. As she worked, the others gathered around, their initial skepticism gradually giving way to professional interest. "This is unorthodox," Williams admitted after studying her diagrams. "But the math checks out." "It's more than unorthodox," Herrera added. "It's revolutionary. These modifications would change how we approach similar junctions throughout the entire structure." Elena looked up from her diagram. "Sometimes the most effective solutions come from seeing old problems from new angles." Montero was studying her with an intensity that suggested he was seeing her clearly for the first time. "Ms. Vega, would you be willing to work with our engineering team to develop these modifications in detail? We could set you up with temporary consulting status while we sort out the other matters we discussed this morning." Elena understood what he was offering, a chance to prove herself beyond the dramatic demonstration in the conference room, to show that her unusual abilities translated to practical solutions for real-world engineering challenges. "I'd be happy to," she replied. As they made their way back to the elevator, Mercedes fell into step beside Elena. "Well played," she said quietly. "You've given them exactly what they need, a solution they couldn't find themselves, while ensuring they still feel in control of the process." "That wasn't my intention," Elena said honestly. "I just wanted to solve the problem." Mercedes smiled. "And that, my dear, is why you'll succeed where many others have failed. You're focused on the work, not the politics." The afternoon that followed was intense. Back at Steel Towers, Elena was installed in a glass-walled conference room with a team of engineers. What had been planned as a brief consultation evolved into a comprehensive review of the Horizon Project's most challenging structural elements. Initially, the team approached her with the cautious respect one might accord a curiosity. They had clearly heard about her demonstration with the steel cylinder. But as the hours passed, that artificial respect transformed into something more genuine as they witnessed her problem-solving abilities firsthand. Elena moved between digital models and physical blueprints with ease, identifying potential issues and suggesting elegant solutions that often caused the senior engineers to exchange impressed glances. Her approach combined rigorous technical knowledge with an almost intuitive understanding of how materials would behave under stress. By 6 o'clock, the team had developed a modified design for the critical stress points that promised to not only solve the immediate issues but also reduce material costs by nearly 8%, a significant amount on a project of this scale. As the engineers packed up, Montero entered the conference room. He had been absent for most of the afternoon, leaving Elena to work directly with the team. "I hear you've been making quite an impression," he said, gesturing for her to remain seated as the others filed out. "Your engineers are extremely talented," Elena replied diplomatically. "They just needed a fresh perspective on a few challenging areas. A perspective that none of our highly paid consultants or in-house experts was able to provide," Montero pointed out, taking a seat across from her. "Which brings me back to our conversation this morning." He placed a folder on the table between them. "This is a formal offer for the position of Chief Materials Engineer at Steel Towers." Elena regarded the folder without reaching for it. "That's unexpected considering how our interview began." Montero had the grace to look slightly uncomfortable. "I believe in results, Ms. Vega. Whatever my initial impressions might have been, your work this afternoon speaks for itself." He pushed the folder toward her. "The compensation package is substantial and includes leadership of your own research division, focused on developing your alloy innovations for commercial applications." It was everything Elena had hoped for when she'd entered the building that morning: validation of her expertise, recognition of her potential, and the resources to pursue her research at scale. Yet she found herself hesitating. "Before I consider this," she said carefully, "I need to understand something. This morning, you and your colleagues were ready to dismiss me based entirely on superficial impressions. What assurance do I have that I won't face the same prejudice from clients, contractors, or other executives?" Montero leaned back, studying her with new respect. "A fair question. The truth is, I can't promise you won't face those challenges. Our industry, like many others, still harbors outdated attitudes." He gestured toward the offices beyond the glass walls. "But I can promise you this. Today, you've earned the respect of some of the finest structural engineers in the country. That counts for a great deal around here." "And the bent steel cylinder didn't hurt," Mercedes added, entering the room in time to hear Montero's response. "Word has spread, by the way. The story is already becoming something of a legend in the building." Elena sighed. "That wasn't my intention." "Perhaps not," Mercedes acknowledged. "But it served a purpose. Sometimes you need to shatter preconceptions before you can build something better in their place." She sat beside Montero. "I've added a clause to your contract, by the way. You'll report directly to me, bypassing some of the more traditional elements of our management structure." Elena finally reached for the folder, opening it to scan the terms. The compensation was indeed impressive, but more important were the provisions for research autonomy and patent rights for her innovations. "You've thought of everything," she commented. "Almost everything," Mercedes corrected. "There's still the matter of how you'll handle the inevitable challenges ahead. Not everyone will be as quick to reassess their judgments as Montero was today." Elena closed the folder. "My grandmother used to say that the strongest thread in her sewing box wasn't the thickest or the most colorful. It was the one that could bend without breaking, that could be woven into any fabric and adapt to its surroundings while maintaining its own integrity." She met Mercedes' gaze directly. "I've spent my entire career being underestimated, being dismissed before I could speak, being judged by my appearance rather than my abilities. And through it all, I've learned to be like that thread, flexible but unbreakable, adaptive but true to myself." Montero nodded slowly. "And occasionally capable of bending steel to make a point." Elena smiled for the first time since entering the building that morning. "Only when absolutely necessary, Mr. Montero." "Javier, please," he corrected, extending his hand. "Welcome to Steel Towers, Elena." This time, when Elena shook his hand, she allowed a hint of her true strength to show, not enough to hurt, but sufficient to remind him of what he had witnessed earlier. His eyes widened slightly, but his smile remained genuine. "I look forward to seeing what we can build together," he said. As Elena packed up her materials, Mercedes lingered behind after Montero left. "One last question," she said quietly. "The steel cylinder this morning. Was that the first time you've done something like that in a professional setting?" Elena considered the question carefully. "The first time, so dramatically. But not the first time I've had to demonstrate that appearances can be deceiving." Mercedes nodded thoughtfully. "The world changes slowly, one bent assumption at a time." She smiled and headed for the door, then paused. "Dinner next week? There are some things about navigating this company that won't be in your contract." "I'd like that," Elena replied. Left alone in the conference room, Elena stood for a moment, taking in the view of the city as dusk began to settle over the skyline. The buildings glowed with internal light, each one a testament to human ingenuity and the hidden strength of materials that most people took for granted. She thought about the journey that had brought her here, the years of study, the countless rejections, the persistent underestimation she had faced at every turn. She thought about her grandmother, who had taught her that true strength often came in unexpected packages, and that the right amount of pressure, applied at precisely the right point, could transform anything. And she thought about the faces of the engineers this afternoon when they realized that this quiet woman in modest clothes possessed not only the physical strength to bend steel, but the intellectual capacity to bend their understanding of what was possible. Tomorrow would bring new challenges. There would be contractors who wouldn't take her seriously, clients who would look past her to the men in the room, colleagues who would question her authority. The bent steel cylinder might have become a legend within steel towers, but the world outside those walls remained unchanged. Yet something had shifted today, not just in how others saw her, but in how she saw herself. For years, she had tried to compensate for her appearance by being more prepared, more precise, more perfect than anyone else in the room. Today, for the first time, she had allowed herself to simply be who she was, a woman of extraordinary capabilities who didn't need to hide either her intelligence or her strength. As she gathered her belongings and headed for the elevator, Elena felt a lightness she hadn't experienced in years. The weight of constantly having to prove herself, of hiding aspects of her true nature, had momentarily lifted. Tomorrow it might return, but for now she would savor this victory, not just the job offer or the professional recognition, but the freedom of being fully seen and valued for exactly who she was. The elevator doors closed, and Elena smiled at her reflection in the polished metal. Sometimes the most powerful force in the world wasn't the ability to bend steel with your hands, but the courage to remain unbent in the face of those who would underestimate you. And that was a strength she had possessed all along. 3 weeks into her new position at Steel Towers, Elena Vega stood at the edge of the construction site, watching as the modified steel connectors she had designed were hoisted into place on the 50th floor of the Horizon project. The morning sun glinted off her white hard hat, personalized now with Chief Materials Engineer printed across the front, a small but significant symbol of her new status. "Quite a sight, isn't it?" said Williams, the project engineer who had initially questioned her unorthodox solutions. He now stood beside her with undisguised admiration as they watched the implementation of her designs. "The stress tests came back even better than predicted. Your modifications are saving us millions in materials and at least 2 months of construction time. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you." Elena nodded, satisfaction warming her chest despite the cool morning air. The true test will come when the upper cantilever sections are added, but the simulation models are promising. "More than promising," Williams corrected. "Revolutionary. Montero's already talking about implementing your approach across all our current projects." Elena watched as construction workers secured the modified junction 40 stories above them. From the ground, the changes she had designed looked minimal. Subtle adjustments to angles, specialized reinforcement plates with geometries inspired by natural structures like honeycomb and bone. But those small changes would cascade throughout the building's structural integrity, allowing it to withstand forces that would have compromised the original design. Much like her own subtle strength, hidden beneath a quiet exterior until the moment it was needed. "The delegation from Zhang International arrives tomorrow," Williams reminded her, changing the subject. "Montero wants you front and center for the presentation. Apparently, word of your innovations has piqued their interest considerably." Elena felt a familiar tension settle between her shoulders. Zhang International was one of the largest development corporations in Asia, with projects spanning multiple continents. Their interest in steel towers methods could lead to international partnerships worth billions. And now, somehow, she was expected to be the face of that potential collaboration. "Has Montero briefed you on Mr. Zhang himself?" Williams asked, studying her expression. "Only that he's the CEO and founder," Elena replied, "and that he's notoriously difficult to impress." Williams laughed, but there was little humor in it. "That's putting it mildly." Jin Zhang has walked out of presentations by some of the most renowned engineers in the world. He once dismissed Norman Foster's team after just 15 minutes. He glanced at Elena. "Just be prepared. He can be rather traditional in his expectations." The subtext was clear enough. A young woman as the lead presenter might not align with Zhang's traditional expectations. 3 weeks ago, Elena might have felt anxiety at this prospect. Today, she simply nodded. "I'll be ready." As they turned to leave the site, Elena's phone chimed with a message from Mercedes. "Lunch today. Need to discuss Zhang meeting. And the rumors." Elena frowned slightly at the last part. Rumors were inevitable in any workplace, she supposed, but she had hoped her demonstrated competence would quickly override whatever stories had emerged about her dramatic interview. Apparently, corporate cultures changed even more slowly than construction methods. The executive dining room on the 59th floor of Steel Towers was a study in understated luxury, all dark wood, soft lighting, and floor-to-ceiling windows offering spectacular views. As a department head, Elena now had access to this rarefied space, though she typically preferred eating with her research team in their laboratory break room. Mercedes was already seated at a corner table when Elena arrived, a salad half-finished in front of her and a stack of folders beside her plate. "Perfect timing," Mercedes said as Elena sat down. "I just ordered for you. The salmon is excellent today." "Thank you," Elena replied, though she hadn't been consulted on her preference. It was a small thing, but a reminder that even Mercedes, her strongest ally in the company, sometimes made assumptions. "Your message mentioned rumors?" Mercedes sighed, setting down her fork. "Always straight to business. I admire that about you." She glanced around to ensure they wouldn't be overheard. "There are stories circulating about how you got the job. Some quite creative interpretations of your demonstration during the interview." "I expected as much," Elena said calmly. "Does it matter?" "It might," Mercedes replied, "particularly with the Zhang delegation arriving tomorrow. Jin Zhang is famously old school, especially about women in leadership positions. If he's heard any of these exaggerated stories." "You're worried he won't take me seriously," Elena finished for her. "I'm worried he'll take you too seriously, but in the wrong way," Mercedes corrected. "The rumors paint you as some kind of superhuman curiosity. The woman who can bend steel with her bare hands." She leaned forward. "Zhang doesn't need a curiosity, Elena. He needs to see a brilliant engineer whose innovations could save his company millions while revolutionizing building safety standards. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us." Now back to the story. Elena absorbed this, recognizing the legitimacy of Mercedes' concern. "How do you suggest I handle it?" "Focus exclusively on the science. Be technical, precise, unemotional." Mercedes paused as a server delivered Elena's salmon. "And perhaps dress the part a bit more convincingly. The board meeting is at 10, followed by lunch with the delegation." Elena glanced down at her current outfit. Tailored black pants and a simple blouse. Professional but not flashy. "What did you have in mind?" "I took the liberty of arranging an appointment with our image consultant this afternoon," Mercedes said, sliding a business card across the table. "Steel Towers maintains an account with her for executives meeting with important clients." Elena picked up the card, an unexpected wave of conflicting emotions washing over her. Part of her appreciated Mercedes' pragmatic approach to corporate politics, while another part felt a sting of disappointment. Was she still being judged by her appearance rather than her innovations? "It's not what you're thinking," Mercedes said softly, reading her expression. "This isn't about making you conform to some outdated standard. It's about giving you every advantage in a situation where the deck is already stacked against you. I understand the strategy, Elena acknowledged. But it feels like a step backward. I thought my work was speaking for itself now. Inside these walls, yes, Mercedes agreed. But Jinzong is arriving with preconceptions that have nothing to do with your work and everything to do with centuries of cultural programming. Sometimes, playing the game on one level allows you to change the rules on another. The image consultant, Sofia Rivera, occupied a sleek office suite just 3 blocks from Steel Towers. Her reputation for transforming technical professionals into polished presenters had made her the go-to resource for Silicon Valley executives and Wall Street analysts alike. "Ms. Vega," she greeted Elena warmly, "Mercedes briefed me on tomorrow's meeting. How can we make sure you walk in with every advantage?" Elena, still uncomfortable with the entire concept, spoke frankly. "I'm an engineer, Ms. Rivera. My work should stand on its own merits." Sophia smiled with unexpected understanding. "In a perfect world, absolutely. But we both know that humans form impressions in the first 7 seconds of an encounter, long before your brilliant engineering insights even enter the conversation." She gestured toward a seating area. "I'm not here to change who you are, only to ensure that your appearance doesn't create unnecessary hurdles to being heard." Something in her approach, practical rather than judgmental, eased Elena's resistance. Over the next hour, Sophia guided her through options that felt like strategic armor rather than superficial makeovers. The resulting selections, a precisely tailored charcoal suit with subtle structural elements that echoed architectural principles and accessories that conveyed authority without ostentation, felt like an extension of Elena's professional identity rather than a disguise. "The goal isn't to make you look like someone else," Sophia explained as Elena examined herself in the mirror. "It's to ensure that your appearance is congruent with your expertise so people focus on what you're saying rather than questioning whether you belong in the room." By the time Elena left Sophia's office, her perspective had shifted. This wasn't about conforming. It was about strategic communication in a world where visual cues carried powerful subtext. And tomorrow's meeting with Zong International was too important to ignore any tactical advantage. That evening, as Elena worked late in her office reviewing the presentation materials for Zong's visit, a knock at her door interrupted her concentration. She looked up to find Herrera standing in the doorway, his expression uncharacteristically hesitant. "Do you have a minute?" he asked, holding a folder. Elena gestured to the chair opposite her desk. Their interactions since her dramatic interview had been strictly professional, but distant. She had neither sought nor expected friendship from the man who had been her most vocal skeptic. "The preliminary tests on the modified alloy came back from the lab," Herrera said, opening the folder. "I thought you should see the results immediately." Elena accepted the report, scanning the data with growing excitement. The experimental alloy she had been developing, a variation of her original innovation but optimized for mass production, had exceeded even her expectations in strength-to-weight ratio and stress adaptation. "This is remarkable," she said, looking up at Herrera. "The molecular distribution is even more uniform than I predicted." Herrera nodded, his usual bravado replaced by genuine professional respect. "It outperforms anything currently on the market by at least 34%. If these results hold its scale," he didn't need to complete the thought. They both understood the implications. "Why bring this to me tonight?" Elena asked. It could have waited until after the Zhang presentation. Herrera was silent for a moment, clearly organizing his thoughts. "I owe you an apology, Ms. Vega. During your interview, I was dismissive. I made assumptions based on appearances rather than evidence." He met her gaze directly. "I was wrong." The admission clearly cost him, but there was a sincerity in his voice that Elena hadn't expected. "Engineering is about evidence," she replied simply. "When presented with new data, we adjust our conclusions." A small smile touched Herrera's lips. Elegantly put. He stood to leave, then paused. "There's something else you should know before tomorrow. Jin Zong specifically requested that you lead the presentation after hearing about your structural innovations from one of our contractors. Mercedes mentioned he was coming, but not that he had requested me personally. What Mercedes may not know is that Zhang has a particular interest in unorthodox approaches. His company built its reputation on implementing technologies that more established firms considered too experimental. Herrera's expression became serious again. But he's also notoriously suspicious of what he calls performance over substance. He walks out of presentations when he senses someone is trying to impress rather than inform. Elena considered this new information. "Thank you for telling me." After Herrera left, Elena turned back to her presentation materials with renewed focus. If Zhang valued substance over performance, perhaps Mercedes' concerns about appearance and impression management were misplaced. Perhaps what Zhang really needed to see was not a carefully polished corporate representative, but a genuine innovator whose ideas could transform his business. The morning of the Zhang presentation dawned clear and bright. Elena dressed in the outfit Sophia had selected, appreciating the subtle confidence it provided without feeling like a costume. The tailored lines and architectural details resonated with her own aesthetic sensibilities while conveying the professionalism the situation demanded. The boardroom on the 60th floor was already filled with Steel Tower's executives when she arrived. Montero nodded approvingly at her appearance, while Mercedes gave her a subtle thumbs up from across the room. The atmosphere crackled with anticipation. Jin Zhang's reputation as both a visionary and a demanding critic had everyone on edge. At precisely 10 o'clock, the elevator doors opened, and Jin Zhang entered, flanked by 4 associates. He was shorter than Elena had expected, with shrewd eyes behind rimless glasses and a bearing that commanded attention despite his modest stature. His impeccably tailored suit spoke of wealth worn with casual confidence. Montero stepped forward with an extended hand. "Mr. Zhang, welcome to Steel Towers. We're honored by your interest in our innovations." Zhang shook his hand briefly, his gaze already moving past Montero to scan the room. When his eyes found Elena, there was a flicker of something. Curiosity, perhaps, or evaluation. After introductions were complete, everyone took their seats around the massive conference table. Montero spoke briefly about Steel Towers' history of innovation, then turned to Elena with a gesture that transferred the floor to her. "And now, our Chief Materials Engineer, Dr. Elena Vega, will present the structural innovations that we believe could revolutionize your Taipei City Center project." Elena stood, feeling the weight of every gaze in the room. This was the moment Mercedes had cautioned her about. The critical first impression that could either open doors or close them before she'd spoken a meaningful word. She looked directly at Jin Zhang, made a split-second decision, and deviated from her planned opening. "Mr. Zhang," she said quietly, "before I begin, I'd like to ask a question. When you enter a new building, what's the first thing you notice?" Zhang's eyebrows rose slightly at this unexpected beginning. The executives around the table shifted uncomfortably. This was not the polished technical presentation they had anticipated. After a moment's consideration, Zhang replied, "The feeling. Not the aesthetics, but how the space feels solid or precarious beneath my feet." Elena nodded. "Exactly. Most people never consciously recognize the engineering that allows them to feel secure 50 stories above the ground. They don't see the structural systems that protect them from winds, earthquakes, or the simple force of gravity." She stepped away from her prepared slides and instead picked up a model that had been placed on a side table, a cross-section of a traditional steel support column alongside one of her modified design. "Traditional building materials work against nature," she continued, warming to her subject. "They resist forces through sheer mass and rigidity. But nature has developed more elegant solutions over millions of years." She handed the models directly to Zhang, who accepted them with evident interest. Notice the difference in weight between these 2 samples, despite their identical strength ratings. Zhang hefted them with an engineer's experienced hands, his expression shifting from polite interest to genuine curiosity. "The modified sample is approximately 30% lighter. 32.7% to be precise," Elena confirmed. "But the real innovation isn't the weight reduction. It's the way the material responds to stress." For the next 45 minutes, Elena led Zhang through the science behind her innovations, explaining complex principles with clarity and passion. She forgot about her carefully selected outfit, about Mercedes, concerns regarding impression management, about the room full of executives watching her every move. Instead, she spoke engineer to engineer, innovator to innovator, her natural enthusiasm for the material shining through every explanation. When she finally concluded, the room fell silent. Zhang sat perfectly still, his fingers steepled beneath his chin as he processed what he had heard. The Steel Tower's executives exchanged nervous glances. Had she gone too technical? Had she violated some cultural protocol they hadn't anticipated? Then Jin Zhang did something that sent a ripple of shock through the room. He stood up and bowed slightly to Elena. "Dr. Vega," he said, his voice carrying clearly. "In 40 years of these presentations, I have rarely encountered someone who truly understands that engineering is not just about calculations but about harmony with natural forces." He turned to Montero. "Your company has found a remarkable talent. I would like to speak with Dr. Vega privately about potential applications for our Taipei project." The meeting adjourned with a buzz of excitement. As the executives filed out, leaving Elena alone with Zhang and 2 of his associates, Montero caught her eye with a look of undisguised admiration. Mercedes squeezed her arm in passing, a silent acknowledgement that Elena had succeeded on her own terms. Once they were alone, Zhang spoke more directly. "I must confess, Dr. Vega, that I came here today with certain preconceptions. There have been interesting rumors about how you secured your position at Steel Towers." Elena felt a moment of tension. So the stories had reached him after all. "I've heard," Zhang continued, "that you demonstrated your understanding of materials in a rather dramatic fashion during your interview." His eyes twinkled with unexpected humor. "Something involving structural steel and unexpected deformation? Engineering principles can sometimes be demonstrated more effectively than explained," Elena replied carefully. Zhang laughed, a genuine sound of delight. "Beautifully stated." He gestured to one of his associates, who opened a briefcase and removed a small metal object, placing it on the table between them. It was a perfect cube of what appeared to be titanium alloy, approximately 2 inches on each side, polished to a mirror finish. "This," Zhang explained, "is a sample of the proprietary material we've been developing for the core structure of our Taipei Tower. Our engineers believe it represents the absolute pinnacle of current metallurgical science, undeformable under any humanly applicable pressure, with the highest strength-to-weight ratio commercially achievable." His expression became more serious. "Before we discuss potential collaboration, I would appreciate your professional assessment of this material." The request's subtext was unmistakable. Zhang had indeed heard the rumors, and now he wanted to witness Elena's unusual abilities firsthand. Elena looked at the gleaming cube, then back at Zhang. "You want me to try to deform it with my hands?" "I want to understand the full range of your expertise," Zhang corrected smoothly, "including your intuitive understanding of material properties." For a moment, Elena considered refusing, explaining that her value as an engineer had nothing to do with physical demonstrations or party tricks. But something in Zhang's expression told her this was a test of authenticity rather than a request for entertainment. She picked up the cube, feeling its cool weight in her palm. Titanium alloy, certainly, but with something else in the molecular matrix, perhaps a carbon nanotube reinforcement structure. "Interesting composition," she commented, studying it closely. "The surface nanopatterning suggests inspiration from mollusk shells, nature's own impact-resistant structures." Zhang nodded, clearly pleased by her observation. "A principle borrowed from abalone. You have a good eye." Elena closed her fingers around the cube, applying gentle pressure at first, then gradually increasing the force. The metal was indeed remarkably resistant, far stronger than the steel cylinder she had bent during her interview. She could feel the molecular structure resisting, the bonds holding firm against her pressure. But then, as she concentrated more deeply, she began to sense minute inconsistencies in the material. Not flaws exactly, but areas where the nanopatterning created subtle stress distribution pathways. With the precision that had always been her true gift, she adjusted her grip, focusing pressure along those pathways. Slowly, almost imperceptibly at first, the perfect cube began to deform. Not dramatically, not with the theatrical bend she had demonstrated with the steel cylinder, but with a controlled, precise reshaping that transformed the cube into a gently curved form that caught the light differently on each surface. When she set it down on the table, it was no longer a cube but an organic shape that resembled a water-worn stone, smooth, asymmetrical, but with an inherent balance that made it oddly beautiful. Zhang stared at the transformed metal, then at Elena, with an expression of profound amazement. "Impossible," he whispered, picking up the reshaped material. Our tests indicated this alloy could withstand pressures up to— The pressure isn't the key, Elena explained quietly. It's understanding where and how to apply it. The strongest material can be reshaped if you work with its internal structure rather than against it. Zhang turned the metal shape in his hands, examining it from every angle. You haven't just deformed it, he realized. You've transformed it into something more harmonious with its inherent properties. He looked up at her with new respect. This is not a parlor trick. This is profound materials science applied through extraordinary means. He set the transformed cube down carefully, as if it were a priceless artifact. Dr. Vega, I came to discuss a building contract. I now find myself wanting to discuss a revolution in how we understand and work with materials. He extended his hand. Would you consider consulting directly with my research team in Taipei? I believe together we could develop applications that go far beyond conventional construction. As Elena shook his hand, she felt a sense of validation deeper than any she had experienced before. Yang wasn't interested in her because she could bend metal with her hands. He recognized that her ability represented a fundamental insight into the nature of materials themselves, an insight that could transform not just buildings, but the entire field of engineering. I would be honored, she replied. Later that evening, as Elena sat alone in her office watching the city lights come alive against the darkening sky, Mercedes knocked on her open door. Congratulations, she said, entering with 2 glasses of champagne. Jinjiang has already called Montero 3 times since leaving the building. Apparently, you've made quite an impression. Elena accepted the glass with a smile. Not in the way we expected. No, Mercedes agreed, taking the seat opposite Elena's desk. You went completely off script, ignored all our careful preparation, and somehow managed to secure not just the Taipei contract, but a personal consulting arrangement that's making our legal team scramble to figure out the details. She raised her glass in a toast. In other words, you were perfectly authentically yourself, and it worked beautifully. Elena laughed softly. I almost followed your advice to the letter. The outfit helped. I felt more confident knowing I looked the part. The outfit was the least important part, Mercedes replied. Though I'm glad Sophia didn't put you in something that felt like a costume. What mattered was that you spoke to Zhang as one innovator to another. No pretense, no performance, just genuine passion for your work. They sipped their champagne in companionable silence for a moment before Mercedes spoke again, her tone more reflective. You know, when I started in this industry 30 years ago, women like me had to become honorary men to succeed. We hid any trace of femininity, adopted aggressive communication styles, and still had to work twice as hard for half the recognition. She studied Elena over the rim of her glass. But you're defining success on your own terms. Not hiding your strength or your brilliance, but not performing them either. Just being exactly who you are. It hasn't always worked out this well, Elena admitted. There have been plenty of Jinzangs who wouldn't give me the time of day, much less a consulting contract. And there will be more, Mercedes acknowledged. But today, you didn't just advance your career, you shifted the ground beneath an entire industry. Zhang will tell others what he witnessed. The story will spread. And somewhere, a young engineer who doesn't fit the traditional mold will hear that story and think, maybe there's a place for me too. As the city lights twinkled beyond her window, Elena considered Mercedes' words. 3 weeks ago, she had bent steel to prove her worth to skeptical executives. Today, she had reshaped titanium to demonstrate principles that could transform building methods across the globe. But perhaps the most important thing she was reshaping was something far less tangible. The very notion of what strength looked like, where it came from, and how it could manifest in unexpected forms. And that, she realized, was a power greater than the ability to bend metal with her hands. It was the power to bend perceptions, to reshape assumptions, and to create space for new possibilities in an industry that had too long defined capability in narrow, restrictive terms. To unexpected strength, she said, raising her glass to Mercedes. And to the courage to use it, Mercedes replied with a smile. 1 year after the Zhang International meeting, Elena Vega stood at the podium of the International Conference on Structural Innovation in Tokyo, surveying the packed auditorium. Engineers, architects, materials, scientists, and industry leaders from around the world filled every seat, with additional attendees lining the walls and spilling into the hallway beyond. The buzz of anticipation was palpable. "Dr. Vega will now present the keynote address," announced the conference chair, her voice carrying over the crowd. Her work on adaptive stress distribution systems has revolutionized structural engineering over the past year, with implementations in 12 major construction projects across 3 continents. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. As Elena stepped forward, the applause was thunderous. Not polite professional acknowledgement, but genuine enthusiasm from an industry that had been transformed by her innovations. She placed her hands on either side of the podium, feeling the solid wood beneath her palms, taking a moment to center herself before beginning. "A building," she began, her voice quiet but clear, "is more than a structure of steel, concrete, and glass. It is a living system that must breathe with the wind, flex with the earth, and adapt to the ever-changing forces of nature and human use." On the massive screen behind her, images appeared, not of completed buildings in their photogenic perfection, but of structures under stress. Computer simulations showing wind forces bending skyscrapers like reeds, earthquake models demonstrating how traditional buildings resisted movement until they shattered, while her adaptive designs yielded and recovered. For too long, we've approached structural engineering as a battle against nature, building rigid fortresses designed to resist forces through sheer mass and inflexibility. Elena moved away from the podium, walking across the stage with the wireless microphone. But what if we approached buildings the way nature approaches its own structures? What if, instead of fighting against forces, we designed materials and systems that work with them? The presentation that followed was a masterclass in innovative thinking, weaving together materials, science, biomimicry, and structural engineering in ways that challenged fundamental assumptions of the field. Elena explained complex principles with clarity and passion, making revolutionary concepts accessible without sacrificing technical precision. What made the greatest impact, however, wasn't just the brilliance of her ideas, but the evidence of their real-world implementation. The Taipei Tower, nearing completion with Jin Zheng's company, incorporated her adaptive stress distribution system throughout its core structure, allowing a design that previous engineering paradigms had declared impossible. The Horizon project in New York, now the most structurally efficient skyscraper in the Western Hemisphere. The earthquake retrofitting system being deployed across vulnerable regions in Japan and California, potentially saving thousands of lives in future seismic events. As Elena concluded her formal presentation, the applause was immediate and sustained. But instead of returning to her seat, she raised a hand for silence, her expression becoming more personal. "Before I take your questions," she said, "I'd like to share something beyond the technical aspects of this work." The audience quieted, intrigued by this departure from the expected format. "A year ago, I sat in an interview where my capabilities were openly questioned because I didn't match the expected profile of a structural engineer." She smiled slightly at the memory. "I was told that authority requires a certain presence, that clients would expect someone who looked the part." She paused, letting the words hang in the air. "That day, I made a choice that changed the trajectory of my career. Instead of trying to become what others expected, I demonstrated who I truly was, in a rather dramatic fashion that involved bending structural steel with my bare hands." A murmur of surprise and interest rippled through the audience. The story had circulated in industry circles, growing more elaborate with each retelling, but few had heard Elena herself confirm it. "The point of that demonstration wasn't to shock or intimidate," she continued. "It was to illustrate a fundamental truth that applies not just to materials, but to human potential. Strength doesn't always look the way we expect it to. And sometimes, what appears to be a limitation can actually be a unique perspective that leads to breakthrough innovation." She gestured toward the screen behind her, where images of her diverse research team at Steel Towers now appeared, engineers from different backgrounds, ages, and experiences working together on prototypes and simulations. "The innovations I've presented today weren't developed by a single person working alone. They emerged from a team that brings together multiple perspectives, approaches, and ways of thinking. Our breakthroughs have come precisely because we don't all think the same way, look the same way, or approach problems the same way." Elena walked back to the podium, her expression earnest. "The greatest barriers to innovation aren't technical. They're perceptual. When we limit who we believe can contribute based on preconceived notions of what an engineer, a leader, or an innovator should look and sound like, we cut ourselves off from the very diversity of thought that fuels true progress. Preparing and narrating the story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. The question and answer session that followed was lively and engaged, focusing not just on technical specifications but on the broader implications of Elena's approach to both materials and team building. Young engineers, particularly women and others from underrepresented groups, lined up at the microphones to ask how they could implement similar principles in environments that remained resistant to change. Start with the work. Elena advised one doctoral student who described facing persistent skepticism despite her excellent research. Excellence is hard to dismiss, even when it comes in unexpected packages. But also, don't be afraid to demonstrate your capabilities in ways that challenge assumptions. Sometimes people need to see to believe. As the session concluded, the conference chair announced a reception that would follow in the adjacent hall. Elena found herself surrounded by colleagues eager to discuss collaboration opportunities, students seeking mentorship, and industry leaders who had traveled from around the world specifically to meet her. Among the crowd, she spotted a familiar face, Jin Zhang, whose company had been the first to fully implement her innovations on a major project. He approached with a warm smile and respectful nod. Dr. Vega, a remarkable presentation. The Taipei Tower is already being hailed as an engineering marvel, and it isn't even completed yet. Thank you, Mr. Zhang. How is the construction progressing? Ahead of schedule and under budget, thanks to your system. He lowered his voice slightly. But I didn't come to discuss the tower. I wanted to tell you about something unexpected that's happening within my company. Elena raised an eyebrow questioningly. After working with you, Zhang continued, I took a closer look at our hiring and promotion practices. I realized we might be overlooking talent that didn't fit our traditional expectations. He smiled with genuine pleasure. We've since revised our approach. The results have been illuminating. Our new head of structural innovation is a young woman from rural China who was previously working in a support role despite having brilliant ideas about seismic adaptation. That's wonderful, Elena replied, genuinely moved by this ripple effect of her work. Your influence extends beyond materials science, Dr. Vega. You've changed how some of us evaluate human potential as well. As Zhang moved on to greet other colleagues, Elena felt a tap on her shoulder. She turned to find Mercedes Fuentes, who had flown in from New York specifically for the conference. Not bad for someone who was once questioned about whether she could handle difficult contractors, Mercedes said with a warm smile. I counted at least 7 major development companies practically begging for your attention just now. Elena laughed. Things have certainly changed. You've changed them, Mercedes corrected. Both through your technical innovations and by simply being unapologetically yourself. They moved through the reception together, Mercedes occasionally pointing out industry figures who had previously been dismissive of Elena's potential and were now eagerly trying to catch her eye. Herrera sends his regards, by the way, Mercedes mentioned as they found a quiet corner with refreshments. He's overseeing the Sao Paulo implementation and couldn't make it, but he made me promise to tell you that the stress tests are exceeding even your projections. He's done remarkable work adapting the system for their specific geological conditions, Elena acknowledged. His understanding of the principles has become quite sophisticated. You've created true believers out of former skeptics, Mercedes observed. Even Montero has been saying that your appointment was the most important decision of his career. Elena smiled at this. Quite a change from questioning whether I had the right presence for the role. Speaking of presence, Mercedes said, gesturing toward the reception where Elena's team members were now enthusiastically explaining aspects of their research to interested colleagues. Your research division has developed quite a reputation. I've heard Steel Towers is being flooded with applications from top engineering graduates who specifically want to work under your leadership. We're looking for innovative thinkers, not just impressive credentials, Elena replied. Some of our most valuable team members came from unexpected backgrounds. As if on cue, a young woman approached them tentatively. She was perhaps 22, wearing a conference badge that identified her as a graduate engineering student from a small technical university not known for producing industry leaders. Dr. Vega? I'm sorry to interrupt, but I just wanted to thank you. Her voice was quiet but determined. "Your keynote today it changed everything for me." Elena smiled encouragingly. "I'm glad it resonated with you." "It's more than that," the student continued. "I've been told repeatedly that I'm too quiet, too methodical, too careful to succeed in structural engineering. That I need to be more assertive, more like—" She gestured vaguely toward some of the more traditionally confident engineers dominating conversations around the room. "And now?" Elena prompted gently. "Now I understand that my approach isn't wrong, just different. And that difference might actually be valuable." She straightened slightly, her confidence visibly growing. "I've been developing a method for analyzing microfracture patterns that's been dismissed as too detail-oriented. But after hearing your talk about finding strength in unexpected places, I'd like to hear more about your research," Elena said sincerely. "Are you free tomorrow morning before the technical sessions begin?" The young woman's expression transformed with surprised delight. "Yes, absolutely." 8 o'clock in the hotel lobby, Elena confirmed. "Bring your data." As the student thanked her profusely and departed, Mercedes shook her head with amused admiration. "You never stop, do you? Even at your own celebration, you're scouting for new talent and ideas." "Isn't that the point?" Elena asked. "To keep building, to keep finding new perspectives?" She looked out over the reception, where engineers from dozens of countries and backgrounds were engaged in animated discussions about the future of structural design. "This isn't an end point. It's just the beginning of what's possible when we expand our definition of what strength looks like." Later that evening, as the reception wound down, Elena found herself alone on the hotel's observation deck, gazing out at the Tokyo skyline. The city stretched before her in a glittering tapestry of light and structure, millions of lives contained within buildings that defied gravity through human ingenuity and understanding of materials. She thought about the journey that had brought her here, from the little girl watching her grandmother's strong hands manipulate fabric with precision and care, to the graduate student whose theories were often dismissed as too unconventional, to the job candidate whose gentle handshake had prompted dismissive laughter around a conference table. The sound of the door opening behind her interrupted her reflections. She turned to find a small group of young engineers, the next generation of innovators who had sought her out throughout the conference for guidance and encouragement. "Dr. Vega," one of them said, slightly hesitant, "we were hoping you might join us. Some of us are gathering to discuss how your adaptive stress principles might be applied to floating structures for coastal cities facing rising sea levels." Elena smiled, touched by their eagerness to include her in their explorations. "I'd be honored. Lead the way." As she followed them back inside, Elena reflected on how true transformation happens, not in grand, dramatic moments, but in these quiet exchanges of ideas, in the gradual shift of perspectives, in the accumulation of small decisions to see beyond conventional wisdom. 6 months later, Elena stood at the base of the completed Taipei Tower, its soaring structure gleaming against a clear blue sky. Jin Jiang stood beside her, both of them gazing upward at what architectural critics were already calling, quote, "the most significant structural innovation of the decade." "It's beautiful," Elena said softly. "Not just aesthetically, but structurally. You can almost see the forces flowing through it, working with gravity rather than against it." Quote. Zhang nodded in agreement. "My engineers tell me that during last month's typhoon, the building responded exactly as your models predicted, flexing with the wind forces rather than resisting them, then returning precisely to its original position. The sensors we installed throughout the core structure are providing invaluable data," Elena replied. "Every weather event, every subtle Earth movement, even the daily thermal expansions and contractions, they're all teaching us more about how adaptive materials perform in real-world conditions. And teaching us something about human adaptability as well," Zhang added thoughtfully. "My board of directors was initially skeptical about implementing such revolutionary approaches. Now they're asking why we aren't applying your principles to all our projects." Elena smiled. "Change is always frightening until it proves itself. Speaking of change," Zhang said, "I understand Steel Towers has created a new executive position for you, Chief Innovation Officer?" "Yes, as of last month. I'm overseeing not just materials research now, but structural design philosophy across all our global projects. Well deserved, Zhang acknowledged. And your research division? Growing rapidly. We've just brought on that young woman I mentioned, the one developing microfracture analysis methods. Her work is already enhancing our understanding of how adaptive materials respond to repeated stress events. They began walking around the tower's perimeter, where the innovative foundation system was partly visible through strategic architectural elements that celebrated rather than concealed the building's engineering. There's something I've been meaning to ask you, Zhang said after a comfortable silence. That day in the Steel Tower's conference room, when you transformed that titanium cube, how did you know you could do it? We had tested that alloy under hydraulic presses, generating forces far greater than any human could apply. Elena considered her answer carefully. I didn't know for certain that I could, but I understood the material structure, not just intellectually but intuitively. I could feel where its strength lay and where its adaptability could be engaged. She looked up at the tower they had created together. It's the same principle that makes this building possible, working with forces rather than against them, finding the pathways where energy can flow instead of fracture. Zhang nodded thoughtfully, a profound principle for engineering. And perhaps for more than engineering. Exactly, Elena agreed. The most remarkable discovery I've made isn't about materials at all. It's that the qualities often dismissed as weaknesses, sensitivity to subtle variations, attention to minute details, willingness to yield rather than dominate, can actually be extraordinary strengths when applied with precision and purpose. As they completed their circuit of the tower, a group of engineering students on a tour recognized Elena and approached hesitantly, asking if she would mind answering some questions about the building's innovative structure. With a warm smile, Elena agreed, watching as they pulled out notebooks and tablets. Their eager faces reminded her of herself at their age, full of ideas that didn't always fit within conventional frameworks, passionate about possibilities that others couldn't yet see. The most important thing to understand about this tower, she began, gesturing upward at the soaring structure, is that its strength comes not from rigidity, but from responsive adaptation. It's strong not because it resists forces, but because it engages with them intelligently. A young woman at the back of the group raised her hand tentatively. Dr. Vega, I read about how you demonstrated your understanding of materials during your job interview at Steel Towers. Is it true that you bent structural steel with your bare hands? Elena saw Zhang hide a smile behind his hand. The story had indeed become somewhat legendary in engineering circles, growing more dramatic with each retelling. What's important isn't the demonstration itself, Elena replied thoughtfully, but what it represented. A challenge to conventional thinking about where strength comes from and what it looks like. She met the young woman's eyes directly. The most powerful force in innovation isn't physical strength or even intellectual brilliance. It's the courage to question fundamental assumptions about what's possible. The students nodded, scribbling notes enthusiastically. As they continued their questions about specific technical aspects of the tower, Elena noticed one student standing slightly apart from the others. A young man whose body language suggested both interest and discomfort, as if he wasn't sure he belonged in the group. When the formal questions concluded and the students began to disperse, Elena approached him. Quote, "You seem to have questions you didn't ask," she said gently. He looked surprised that she had noticed him. I'm not actually an engineering student," he admitted. "I'm studying art and design. I came with my roommate because I'm fascinated by the tower's form, but I was embarrassed to ask questions that might seem naive from a technical perspective." Art and engineering have more in common than most people realize, Elena replied. Both seek to understand the relationship between form and function, between beauty and purpose. The young man's expression brightened. That's exactly what I'm exploring in my thesis, how structural principles inform aesthetic choices and vice versa. Then you absolutely should ask questions, Elena encouraged. Your perspective might see connections that technically focused minds might miss. As the student began to share his observations about the tower's visual rhythms and how they related to its structural systems, Elena was struck by the insight of his analysis. His artistic eye perceived patterns and relationships that engineering formulas alone might never reveal. This, she realized, was perhaps the most profound legacy of her work. Not just the buildings that would stand for generations or the materials innovations that would save lives during natural disasters, but these moments of connection across disciplines, perspectives, and experiences. The recognition that breakthrough thinking happened at the intersections, in the spaces between established categories, in the minds of those who didn't fit neatly into conventional expectations. Later that evening, as Elena prepared for her keynote address at the tower's official opening ceremony, she paused to look at her reflection in the hotel mirror. The woman who looked back at her was not so different from the one who had walked nervously into steel towers for that fateful interview. Still modest in her appearance, still quiet in her demeanor, still more interested in ideas than in commanding attention. But there was a quiet confidence in her bearing now, a certainty that came not from external validation, but from the knowledge that she had remained true to herself while transforming an industry's understanding of what was possible. Her phone chimed with a message from Mercedes. Breaking news. Steel towers stock up 12% on announcement of your new Global Innovation Initiative. Montero says to tell you the board has unanimously approved the expanded research budget. Congratulations! Elena smiled at the message. The expanded budget meant she could bring on more researchers from non-traditional backgrounds, could pursue applications of her adaptive materials principles in affordable housing, and disaster-resistant infrastructure for vulnerable communities. The commercial successes of projects like the Taipei Tower were opening doors for innovations that could benefit those who needed them most. As she gathered her notes for the evening's address, Elena thought about the journey ahead. There would always be those who judged by appearances, who failed to recognize capability when it didn't match their expectations. There would be new battles for recognition, new challenges to overcome. But she also thought about the young engineers and students she had met, about Zhenjiang's revised hiring practices, about the gradually shifting culture at steel towers itself. Each small change was like one of those microscopic adjustments in a material's molecular structure, seemingly insignificant in isolation, but collectively capable of transforming the entire system's response to pressure. The true strength of any structure, whether a skyscraper, an organization, or a society, lay not in rigid resistance to change, but in its capacity to adapt, to redistribute forces, to find harmony between seemingly opposing elements. And perhaps her greatest contribution wasn't bending steel with her hands, but bending perceptions with her mind, helping others see that true innovation comes not from conforming to expectations, but from embracing the unique perspectives that arise when we allow ourselves to be exactly who we are. As Elena stepped onto the stage that evening, greeted by applause from industry leaders, government officials, and the engineering team that had brought the Taipei Tower from concept to reality, she felt a sense of completion. Not an ending, but a fulfillment of potential that opened the door to even greater possibilities ahead. The journey from that conference room, where her handshake had been mocked, to this stage, where her innovations were being celebrated, had not been easy or straightforward. There had been setbacks and challenges, moments of doubt and frustration, but through it all, she had remained true to her understanding that real strength came not from dominating forces, but from engaging with them intelligently. And in doing so, she had not only transformed materials and buildings, but perceptions and possibilities, creating space for a new generation of innovators who might otherwise have been overlooked, underestimated, or dismissed. As she began her address, Elena glanced out at the audience and spotted that young art student sitting beside engineers and architects, his presence a small but significant symbol of the bridges being built between disciplines and perspectives. The Taipei Tower stands before us, not just as a feat of engineering, she began, but as a testament to what becomes possible when we expand our understanding of strength, of capability, of potential. When we recognize that innovation often comes from unexpected sources, in unexpected forms, through unexpected hands. And in that moment, Elena Vega, once dismissed for her gentle handshake and quiet demeanor, stood as living proof that true strength had never been about appearances, but about the courage to remain authentically yourself in a world that too often rewards conformity over contribution. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.